Hi everyone, it's Ren here, hope you're doing well. And in this video, as you might have noticed from the slightly provocative title, we're going to be talking about whether INFJs exist. And as you can already guess, I'm asking this question not as a closed kind of question, whether they exist as in yes or no, but more as an open question, as an opportunity to think about MBTI, typology, and the meaning that they have in people's lives, and also the credence that can be given to that. I've had a few comments, in the last few months. I've had comments here and there about people who are, I would say, like relatively skeptical of the extent to which MBTI has explanatory value, credible explanatory value, when it comes to the way that people are, the way that people function. But you nevertheless are willing to have an exchange, right? You have the people who are completely closed off. They're very unlikely to post comment on my channel, but you have the people who are kind of in between, and I think that this video is also an opportunity to talk to them. But it's a general question that I ask myself sometimes as well. Do INFJs exist? And by this I also mean, do ENFPs exist? Do INTJs exist? Do sensor types, ISFPs, do they exist? Essentially, do these people exist? And the answer, I think, is it depends. It depends. And I think that there is one way in which INFJs do exist, and another way in which INFJs do not exist. And my sense, my intuition tells me that the attempts at discrediting the MBTI model aim at, if you like, at only showing that the INFJs do not exist in the way in which I understand that, but they do not cast light on the way in which they do exist. So what do I mean by this? It's quite a subtle distinction, but I think that it is very much the core of, it's the battlefield that, if it is won, can really allow the model to gain in credibility among the people who can be convinced of it, people who are willing to, people who are open towards being convinced, being persuaded. We're not really interested in, here are the people who are already convinced, and or we're not really interested in the people who are just adamantly against it, dogmatically against it, in objectively speaking. In philosophy, you have a debate that's been going on for a long time. Actually, it's been going on ever since Plato, and even before Plato. And it's debates, it's called the debates about universals. Maybe if you've done philosophy before, you have come across this particular debate. It discusses the distinction between universals and particulars. For example, it asks questions such as, for example, am I a universal or am I a particular? Well, I'm a particular person, I'm a particular individual, living in a particular society, coming from a particular place. So I'm obviously in many ways a particular, or most ways and always a particular object, entity, subject. You can apply any terms. The city of Paris is a particular. Is the concept of city a particular in the same way that the city of Paris is a particular? Is the concept of person the same particular that I, as a person called Ren, am a particular? Well, I mean, I think intuitively it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that there is a certain universality to the concepts of city, in the same way that there's a universality to the concept of person. And you could apply also universality to the concept of number and to many other things. And philosophers like to think about how to determine the metaphysical nature of universals as opposed to particulars, which means that it's quite hard for a philosopher, for someone who does philosophy and tries to explain the nature of reality, for instance, it's quite difficult to tell what it is about universals, or what look like universals, that distinguishes them from particulars. Now, I think that in the case of the MBTI types, and here I'm talking about the INFJ because that's the type I know the best, what is true is that I think INFJs do not exist as universals. And I don't think ENFPs or ESFPs or ESFJs exist as universals. So what does that mean? It means that it is not like these MBTI categories, they're not things like abstract things that exist and that are inhabited by a person who comes into the world and embraces it. Okay? They're not that, I don't think. But I think that each person is a particular, obviously, and that's among all the populations in the world, and a population of all these particulars who have their own distinctive traits, there are family relationships, people who behave in certain ways, people who see the world in certain ways, you know, and these family relationships are very complex, but you see patterns. And so, because you see patterns of resemblance, so it's not like universals that are just brought together as distinct essences living next to each other, like in a Platonic sense. I don't think that exists. But you have certain kinds of behavior, ways of looking at the world, ways of relating to cognition that have resemblances in the same way that some faces have resemblances. Okay? And when we identify the different patterns, of course, we need to use some sort of frame, some kind of model with its own categories, but the categories are just names. They name something, but in naming the thing, they do not create an abstract version of a universality of the thing. Okay? And so, what's really useful about the MBTI model is that it says there are all these patterns of behavior among these people. And maybe what we could do is propose to speak in terms of maybe like thousands of different patterns, but if reasoning in terms of extended families, if we take the broadest possible families, we could propose to derive a typology of 16 families that bring together people who have a certain amount of family resemblance to belong to the same family. And so we will bring together people who are using functions in the same way, more or less, in a roughly similar patterns, even though there's wide variation between the patterns. Enough family resemblance, and maybe that can be discussed. We're talking about particulars, not absolutes, so there's no problem with pragmatically trying to figure out what the limit is between a family and another. Maybe we could say, well, is that the tendency towards, you know, introverted intuition or extroverted feeling, or, you know, any other function. And then we look at the other traits that are maybe not quite as prominent, and we look at again, you can reason in terms of family traits, and you look at the auxiliary, you look at the tertiary, and the etc., etc. And from that you just organize different families, and then you name them according to the traits that they seem to exhibit. And so you say, okay, they exhibit these different traits, well, that tends towards, and so you know that there is a connection between the type of a person, INFJ, and the function stack. All right, it's not a case of a type existing, and if you happen to have a certain function stack, you fit that type. No, it's that, because that would be reasoning in terms of it being a universal. It's a case of you as a particular having a certain function use, showing a pattern that has family resemblance with other patterns, from which we can derive a certain family that has that certain pattern of function use, from which we derive a particular notation, which in this case is the MBTI notation. And so we know that if someone is NIFETISE, that means the notation INFJ. If someone is SCFIT and I, we know we can clearly easily derive ESFP, because there is a correspondence in our notation between the function use and the letters. But the letters do not exist. Of course they don't exist. INFJ, like the INFJ category, does not exist. It's a name we give to a certain family pattern of function use. So what I mean is, as far as I see it, it's, you know, if there is a battle to be had, it is not a battle that takes place at the level of the MBTI types, the INFJ type or the ENFP type, because those are not universals. They're not things that actually have independent existence. They're just names we give to simplify our reference to particular patterns of function use. And the people who identify with one another, they don't identify with one another because they think that they belong to this universal category of INFJ-ness rare. They do when they're a bit younger, and they get tired of it if that's how they look at it. But eventually they don't do that. They just know that if other people identify with that kind of family pattern of function use, there will be ways to relate. So underneath this apparent superficial identification with a universal that is not really a universal, there is really a very deeply human and natural desire to connect with other people with whom we feel a certain kind of kinship. And that is, to me, not a particularly controversial claim. So when you reorient the conversation in that way, you realize that it doesn't actually mean anything. It's meaningless to say that there's no such thing as INFJ, because that's only a name we give to family resemblance between individual people exhibiting a particular pattern of function use. So it's not really thinking in terms of rigid, separate categories. And people who think like that in the MBTI community are people who are really new to MBTI, or people who don't really understand it well. People who understand it well are people who are interested in looking at the pattern of function use. And in general, the reason why I tend to be a little bit skeptical of going too far into the theorizing about the function use and the shadow and like the shadow functions and POLR and these different things is that it disturbs my concepts of what a simple pattern in the family relations can deliver. You know, the parsimony of a theory and the model or theory or model of MBTI is just a model. It tries to explain something about the nature of reality, in this case the nature of personality that we see in human beings. It's better if it's parsimonious, not if it is absolutely overwhelmed with extra things that are ultimately not that useful in predicting behavior. And there is a principle in philosophy that is called the principle of parsimony, also Occam's razor, which says do not add additional in metaphysics, additional objects, or do not add additional parameters that do not contribute anything to the theory. You just add them, but there's no reason to add them. And so that's why I'm quite happy to remain at the level of the function use. I think that's already sufficient. But as gathering together a family of users of NIFETI, etc., INFJs exist. But the INFJ type as a universal category does not exist. All right, let me know what you think, guys, and if that made any sense. See you soon.